Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of the Fisher's podcast series, Between the Pillars. I'm John Shoesmith, the Outreach Librarian here at Fisher, and I can actually say here at Fisher for the first time in a while, because as you can see, I'm actually at the Fisher Library. The city is no longer under a stay-at-home mandate, but we're obviously still following all health and safety protocols. For one, I think I'm the only one in the library right now. My colleague David was here a little while ago, so I'm the only one in the building at this moment. But I wanted to come in because this is an interesting episode we're going to be doing. We're going to be talking about specifically about the Internet Archive and some of the material that we have up on the Internet Archive. And that's why we invited today's participant, Rachael Fraser, who's been writing a blog for us, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So it's one of the reasons why I want to focus in on Internet Archives, because especially since we've been closed since the pandemic, it's the one resource we have where it's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, where we have so many of our materials up on that up on the Internet Archive site. So it's a great resource for those that obviously can't visit the library. And we're going to talk about sort of some of the highlights that we have up on the Internet Archive. So just to provide some context before we learn a bit more about Rachael and look at the items she wants to highlight, I want to talk a little bit about the Fisher's relationship to the Internet Archive. It actually goes back over a dozen years now. And in fact, with some help from my colleague Liz Rodolfo this morning, who used to work in Internet Archive before she joined the Fisher, we found what we think was the very first item that we had scanned at Internet Archive, and it was Richard Baxter's answer to Dr. Edward Still from 1680. And according to the metadata, if the metadata is correct, but it should be, it was scanned in the summer of 2006. So as you can see, it's a relationship that we have with Internet Archive that goes back quite a long way. And what I'll do, actually, before we introduce Rachael and learn a bit more about her, I wanted to share sort of the home screen that we have for Fisher. This is basically the Fisher landing page for the Internet Archive. It's you can find it just by visiting archive.org. And as you can see, we have quite a number of items scanned at the Internet Archive, over 23,000, including some collections, like some very specific collections, whether it's Canadiana, biodiversity, but we have a lot of sort of these also just kind of one-off things that we've sent to the Internet Archive over the past, as I said, 12, 15 years. So as I said, it's a great resource. We will post the actual link to this homepage in the comments section of the YouTube page when we post this. So please visit it. There's a lot of fantastic material on here, and hopefully you'll find something that matches your interests or your research needs as well. So let's introduce Rachael. Rachael's actually interesting because we've had almost everyone we've interviewed so far has kind of come through Fisher as a student. Rachael still is a student. So she's been a student at the iSchool now for 3 years, is that right?
Technically, yeah, 3 years.
3 years. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about, Rachael sits right in front of me as well, so where I am in the workroom, so I've got to know her quite well. But maybe you can just talk a little bit about yourself. And one thing I always like to ask everybody that's on this, especially the students, is whether they remember the very first project that you worked on at Fisher. Maybe you can just kind of detail what you did when you first arrived.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I'm Rachael. I'm technically a second year student in archives and records management. I'm actually graduating in June this year. I've technically been a student for 3 years though, because I took a maternity leave in between the 2 years that I was studying here. And like I've been working at Fisher the entire time, so I've been lucky for that. Yeah, and so the first project I actually worked on, I remember because it wasn't that long ago, was actually with the Internet Archive too. So when I started, I was given 2 projects, and I'll talk about the one with the Internet Archive because that one was actually concluded before I was gone. So basically, I had a spreadsheet of just different documents that Fisher and the Internet Archive worked together to decide should be digitized for the Internet Archive. So I would take a truck, go down to the basement, pull all of these books, and then I would determine whether or not they were suitable to be digitized. So I'd have to open them, make sure there was like no missing pages, make sure that when I opened them that the spine didn't like crack in half or something like that, so that they could actually be pressed by the 2 plates to be flattened for the camera. So that was my first project. Most of the books on there were pretty random. There wasn't really any major collections. The one I do remember was a collection of Ukrainian Canadian pamphlets from like the early 1900s,
right,
up to like 1914, I think. And that was like a big one that I did. But that was the first project that I did.
Funny, I didn't know that was you worked with I. So they basically were a very good choice then to do the that we have on the website. And essentially what it is, we started a blog. For those that don't know, we started a blog on our website just around the time that that we closed our doors in March. And one of the things we thought about doing, since we had so much amazing material up on the Internet Archive, we thought we'd highlight something every week from the Internet Archive. And so Rachel's been doing that now for almost a year, which is great. And the one thing I'm curious about, Rachel, is with such vast amount of material that's on there, as I said, 23,000 items, how do you choose one item a week? I mean, do you have a process that you go through?
Sort of. So it depends on like what's happening. Like I try to do like sort of timely, what's happening if there's like any holidays around. So I did one this past week for International Women's Day. I've done one for Christmas, for New Year's, Halloween, Remembrance Day. So if there's something like that going on, then that definitely, I try to find something that can work with that.
Right.
Other than that, though, I usually stick between the Canadiana Biodiversity and the Chapbook collection, just because some of the collections that are on the Internet Archive are not in English, so that's a little difficult for me. Although I'd like to, if I have some time, try to do something in French, because there's a lot in there in French, and I have a little bit of a working knowledge of French. Yep. So I'm going to see if I can do that. But for the most part, it's pretty random. I just like scroll through the collections and see if something catches my eye, and I think this looks interesting to me. Maybe it'll be interesting to other people. But for the most part, I don't really have a very specific process. I just look for something that looks cool, honestly.
Do you have particular interest then in terms of, I mean, one of the things that people that come to rare books and special collections, they tend to focus in on certain areas of interest. I mean, do you have certain areas of interest within rare books that kind of strikes your fancy?
I mean, yeah, I guess I do. So I have a background in history. I have 2 previous degrees in history, and I focused on Canadian history. So anything in Canadian history or Canadiana is going to be like a strong research interest for me. And I also have a lot of interest in culinary. So I've only done one cookbook, but I'd like to find one at some point that's different enough to do another post. But those are my main interests.
And we will be showing the cookbook very shortly. Is there anything that you sort of profiled that you kind of surprised you and you actually learned something that you didn't know about before?
That's a tough one. I might have to come back to that.
Okay, we'll think about that. Why don't we show some items? Because that's the reason why I came in today, because we can show them on Internet Archive. You can look all these for yourself on Internet Archive, but I wanted to come in and actually handle the materials myself, since I thought that would be a good idea. So we're going to start with a chapbook. And this is actually, maybe you could talk a little bit about this. Oops, I guess I have to share my, that would help if I showed the camera. There we go. So, okay.
And this is actually the first time I'm seeing these books as well, because I've only seen them on the Internet Archive. So this is pretty exciting for me.
Okay. And hopefully the next time you get to actually come to the library, you get to actually see these. So just focusing on it a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about this item, the Magic Oracle.
Yeah, so the Magic Oracle, I wrote a post on this chapbook around Halloween. It was sometime in October. I wanted to find stuff that, kind of fit the theme of Halloween. So I was looking for stuff on like maybe the occult or kind of like horror stories that I could possibly find. So I found this in the chapbook collection. So there's like a whole series of chapbook collections on the Internet Archive for Fisher that from this like Scottish chapbook series. And it looks like they're actually all of them, if not most of them, are bound together in this book.
Bound, there's probably about, when I look through this, it's probably about at least a dozen in here in this volume.
So I found this one and I thought it was interesting because it's called Magic Oracle or Conjurer's Guide. So I thought it would have something in there, maybe kind of like spooky for Halloween. And it's also in the title as well. It's called The Whole Art of Legerdemain, which I'm butchering that, but I wasn't sure what that meant. So I had to look it up, and basically it's like sleight of hand tricks. So I'm like, okay, this is perfect for Halloween. So basically,
have you ever done magic out of curiosity?
no, I haven't, but I think occult stuff is kind of interesting. So basically it's just full of like different card tricks, dice games, like sleight of hand tricks, number tricks. On page 11 through 14, there's a couple of like counting tricks, and a lot of them I noticed when I was doing this are basically just math tricks. So it says, if you're quick with numbers, if you're quick with adding and subtracting before whoever you're trying to, play this trick on, can figure out what you're trying to do, then it'll feel like a magic trick to them. You'll surprise them.
Right.
So there's one on how to like guess somebody's age. I think that one's on page 11, or sorry, guess what number they're thinking of. And it's just adding and subtracting. You tell them like a series of instructions to follow, and then you just have to be quicker than them to figure it out.
Okay.
Yeah. But what's interesting about this book is that closer towards the end, there's instructions on how to make like fireworks and fireballs and different kinds of like explosions, something called like a fiery fountain, basically what we think of sparklers. It says like how to have luminous writing in the dark. And you can see on like the very last page there, there's a little paragraph there called how to eat fire and blow it up in your mouth. So how to like breathe fire. And I thought it was cool that this is how it decided to like end the chapbook, with sort of this climax of like, this is going to be the most shocking and difficult trick. If you read it, it sounds horrible. Like it doesn't sound like something you'd ever want to do. So I definitely would not like recommend doing that. But it's also funny because the very last sentence says, fire eaters don't have a very good complexion. So possibly from either whatever they do to prepare their mouth and face so that it's not burned, or maybe from like burning off their eyebrows from trying to do this trick.
Right. Pity they don't have an illustration to go with it.
I know, it wasn't a very illustrative, like heavy book, which is unfortunate, but
there's some other great chapbooks in here though, and these are all being digitized. So there's a story about someone and their cat. There's a story about Cinderella in here as well. Tale of Cinderella. So an excellent resource, I think, that we started with. So let's go next to something else that we all at Fisher love, which is monsters. Yes. I apologize, for some reason the camera is doing everything backwards on me. So Monsters of the Sea.
Yes, Monsters of the Sea. So Monsters of the Sea I found in the biodiversity collection. And I really like the biodiversity collection. I've had a lot of fun with it. There's all kinds of books in there that are on like birds and butterflies and insects and flowers, and they're all like beautifully illustrated. But I found this one and I thought it was kind of odd that it was in the biodiversity collection, just because the title's Monsters of the Sea, legendary and authentic. So like, I don't know, you wouldn't think maybe finding a book on monsters would be in like a biodiversity collection.
Right.
So that's what grabbed me for that book.
To get this stuff.
And in the text, there's an explanation as to like why this book would be interesting for readers. And it says that it was easy for people, back in the day, even though this book was written in 1887, like sea exploration wasn't very thorough. So it was easy for sailors' imaginations to run wild with what they would find under the sea, which is why the idea of Monsters of the Sea kind of came about. And like on the frontispiece there that yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I was out of focus there for a while. I don't know.
That's okay.
There we go.
This book is also really beautiful illustrated. So that's one of the ones that I focused on when I wrote my piece on this.
Right.
A picture of like a giant squid being harpooned by the boat, and looks like it's kind of being like pulled up onto the deck. you know, like an animal like this would have been probably very frightening. I mean, I'm sure it's still frightening if somebody comes across one when they're
Right.
doing sea exploration. Like, they're huge. They're not usually seen or captured alive. That's my understanding.
Right.
So I'm sure it would have like um, been been like an influence for a lot of, you know, legends of the deep sea.
It's kind of giving me a new appreciation for the calamari that I like to eat.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. So what else do we have here?
Mhm.
You point out another section, which is, and I
Yeah.
apologize again, we've got some noise going on in the background.
So this is a picture of the Kraken, which I knew I was going to find in this book. So I definitely wanted to highlight that when I wrote the piece,
Yeah.
because I'm sure we've all heard of the Kraken, you know, from popular culture. It's pretty well known in movies and stuff. So that is an image of the Kraken attacking a ship, and it says the Kraken is seen as in the eye of imagination. So it's not
Right.
like somebody saw this and then was like, oh, this is what happened. It's how they would imagine it based on, you know, stories. And it looks like a giant octopus.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So, you know, it's probably what influenced it. There's a lot of stories in the book about sailors encountering the Kraken, and that it's so big, you know, it's often mistaken as an island. People
Right.
land on it and then they realize they've landed on the body of the Kraken.
It's interesting too, because I mean, when you look at this on Internet Archive, the images are really fantastic too. I mean, the text
They
is
are.
great, but the fact that you can really focus in on some of the fabulous illustrations in a lot of these.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's the Monsters of the Sea.
Mhm.
Let's go to one last thing, which you talked about a little bit already in terms of one of your interests, which is culinary.
Yes.
So let's go up a bit more. Canadian Family Cookbook. One of, I
Yes.
should say, many cookbooks we have at Fisher.
Yeah. So this was the first one that I wrote back in, I think it was in August or September.
Right.
And I wanted to start with something that I felt like I had a bit of like background knowledge, so I feel a little bit more confident with my first post.
Right.
I've always had an interest in culinary and cooking and baking. It's my favorite pastime. And I also wrote my master's thesis in history in a previous degree on food rationing in Halifax during World War II,
Oh,
and
wow. Okay.
the housewives' response to, you know, having less ingredients, different ingredients, how they dealt with rationing.
Right.
So I have some experience with cookbooks. So this is the one I started with, and it's from the Canadiana collection.
Interesting about this is that, you know, there's, again, one of those books that I guess is it illustrated at all? It's good.
There's a few, but it's also not very heavily illustrated.
Right. It's
Yeah.
also interesting. They don't seem to have really an introduction. It goes straight into.
No, there isn't. I noticed that too. It goes right into recipes.
Okay. Yeah. So if you look at the table of contents, you can get a little closer. So we've got everything we need to know.
Yeah.
Soups, fish, meats, poultry and game, vegetables. So let's focus
Yeah,
in.
it has everything. Which I've also noticed about cookbooks from like this time period. They have
Right.
all these different categories and tons of recipes in each of them.
Okay. So you wanted to highlight something in particular in this book,
Yeah,
which
that I
was
found kind of
the
unusual.
breads and muffins section.
Yeah. Actually, it was funny because when I found this book, when I decided to write on this book, you know, I tied it a little bit into sort of like the pandemic, because a lot of people started baking during the
Right.
pandemic as like a pastime, and like the whole sourdough craze. There is no recipe in this book for sourdough bread.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's too bad.
That's what I wanted to look for as sort of like my highlight. And there's no recipe for sourdough bread in here. I looked up and down, unless I missed it. I
Right.
looked up and down each bread, muffin, cake, like every section that could have had it. And there's no recipe in here for sourdough, which is really strange.
Wow. Okay. But
Yeah.
there is some interesting things about muffins and old-fashioned yeast.
Yeah, the old-fashioned yeast recipe is unusual. So yeah, you can see it there. It calls for potatoes, water, sugar, salt, a handful of hops, and yeast cake, which like I'm a pretty seasoned baker and I have never heard of yeast cake. Like maybe
Right.
that's not a good thing. But so I looked it up and like I don't know if you can see some of these other recipes nearby, they call for fresh yeast,
Right.
which I don't think we're used to. I mean, we're so used to using dried yeast and instant yeast when making bread. I'd never heard of using
Yeast
fresh
cake. Yeah.
yeast cake. Yeah. So I looked it up and it seems like it's very hard to get in Canada. There
Right.
was like there was a lot of American sites that would ship within the States, but not Canada. So I don't know how you'd get your hands on it in this country.
Would you ever try making something from this, or did you try making something from this cookbook?
I didn't, but that's not to say that I wouldn't. It just depends on what it is, because as somebody who's looked at a lot of cookbooks from war era and earlier, and or from like the 1950s, some recipes are just strange from
Yeah.
back then, especially ones that call for trying to stretch ingredients. Like I remember a particular one, because I focused a lot on butter and fats when I did my thesis as just like a specific item that was rationed, and stretching butter with like water and gelatin and like doing strange things, it just doesn't sound pleasant. So it would definitely depend on what it was.
I like this. I like this here. You have it has a section for writing your own recipes in the book,
Yes.
which is kind of handy, I guess.
Yeah.
It's a pity these weren't written in.
Yeah. Yeah, and it has like different sections on like besides recipes to eat, it has sections on, there's a section called toilet recipes, which is on like potpourri and like different like salves and balms that you can like put on. So like just the things that maybe you'd like keep in your bathroom. So that was interesting too.
Very cool. Okay, let me go put my video back on.
Yeah.
So this only just sort of touches on sort of a few of the things you've written about. Do you remember some of the other things you've written about then in terms of some of the AI books?
Yeah, so I had a hard time narrowing these down. I wanted to pick one from each of like the main collections that I focused on. So I
Right.
picked one from the three each. But like yeah, I had a hard time narrowing it down because I've seen some really cool stuff on the Internet Archive.
Right.
I also really liked the Eaton's Christmas catalog
Right.
that was also featured in Fisher's online digital
Yep.
exhibition for at Christmas time. And that one was really cool. Um, and just kind of like nostalgic. I mean, I don't remember Eaton's, but like I can just imagine like just Christmas catalogs in general.
Right.
Um, I also wrote one on the Delineator, which is like a 19th century fashion publication, which was also really, it was just like beautiful. Like the colors, the illustrations were gorgeous. And just anything else from like the biodiversity collection on birds or butterflies, they're also really just like gorgeous illustrations. So those ones, like I had a hard time.
They might be nice to revisit when we hit spring and we actually have some nice weather too.
Yeah, actually, I have a few lined up that I was thinking of. There's just tons on there.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. This has been great, Rachel. So continue to do the great work you're doing on the blog, because we all appreciate it here at Fisher. Because actually, it educates us in terms of, because obviously with 23,000 items on the Internet Archive, even we don't know what's
Yeah.
on there most of the time. So it's very instructive for us to know some of the great material that is part of that resource. So thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
And
Fun.
this has been great. Rachel will be doing these for hopefully through the rest of the summer. And we have another podcast coming up in 2 weeks. And it's going to be an interesting one because we're going to focus in on Alice in Wonderland. So, and the great Alice in Wonderland collection we have here at Fisher Library. So thanks again, Rachel. Please join
Thank
us
you.
again in 2 weeks, and have a nice weekend, everyone.